Okay, we're going to run one of our videos, our customer videos, and then we're going to bring our next guest on.
In this fast-paced world, your company needs a scalable, vendor-neutral, completely integrated, and trusted identity and access management platform.
Are we doing one of those buzzword-filled videos?
You have the great duty of taking your company to the future. You need to enable seamless access for all your users across countless devices and endless services, all while protecting business-critical data from hackers. Your employees want on-demand access to cloud apps, and you, as a trusted leader, need complete visibility and control. Those mission-critical needs are why Okta was born and built in the cloud.
Born?
Are you interested in centralizing identity into a single pane of glass? And you, delivering access to thousands of best-of-breed apps?
You know I work here, right? You don't have to sell me on anything.
Decreasing the time wasted resetting passwords, reducing risk.
When I started, I got instant access to all the apps I need without having to remember a bunch of ridiculously complex passwords.
81% of data breaches occur from weak or stolen credentials. Why live in fear of vulnerable authentication systems when you could Okta?
Okta isn't really a verb. Plus, we have MFA. And when someone leaves the company, they instantly lose all of their access too.
Like magic, Okta helps protect your data.
It's not really magic. Okta uses modern technology to make sure that people are who they say they are. Now that we check our email on the go and do work on personal laptops, you need way more than a password to verify your identity.
Magic! Provisioning, deprovisioning, reassigning user groups, mobile access, compliance reporting, new employees who need more apps now!
Okay, what?
And all the time IT spends keeping the lights on is time wasted. Not to mention time and resources spent integrating to another directory. Okta provides a cloud-based flexible directory where you can manage all your users, groups, applications, and devices.
Just think of it as a customizable Rolodex of your employees, with all the important information you need to know about them.
Okta is a modern cloud-based identity solution. With one architecture and thousands of apps, you can enable the digital transformation superhighway.
Let's wrap this up, shall we?
Centralize identity. Reduce the attack surface. I love Okta. You love Okta. Everyone loves it. Don't you? Modern devices.
This voiceover is super intense.
Platforms.
I think it's like glitching.
New digital projects. Frictionless, seamless experiences.
Come on, let's go. You did good. How about a bubbly water?
Extended enterprise. Robust platforms. Flexible. On the go. Start with Okta. Go anywhere.
You don't have to be dull, do you, to get a good message across in there. There's some time to laugh at yourself, have some humor, and have some at least throwing that communication type of approach to how we bring our messages out. Good stuff. Matt, you're going to bring my notes back up in there? He's just working on that, I'm sure. Our next presentation is started out with a discussion with me and Keith Elliot, who you'll meet in a second. Keith, where are you, Keith? Tell me you're here. There. Keith? Oh, there he is. Come on up, Keith. And Keith and I were talking. We've only met over the phone so far in this thing, but we're starting to talk about what better way to figure out what you need to do post-breach than to talk to somebody who actually investigates these things. Now, I'm not an investigator, I just play one on TV, but Keith is a real investigator. Keith Elliott's president and CEO of Reed Research, and he's going to tell us what to do after a breach.
So I get to wake you all up after lunch. So as Jim said, I'm an investigator. I'm one of the oddities in this room. I'm actually not a IT professional in any capacity. So a little intimidating being in a room speaking about IT breaches and things that happen in the world of IT when you're not actually an IT professional. So I own and operate an investigation agency, and what we are is we're the human factor when it comes to investigations. So there's lots of digital professionals in the world and IT professionals that ultimately deal with the elements that, are we clicking? I can't see. Oh. Come on. One more. All right, so that we deal with when we get an actual attack. Like, what does that attack look like? How does that go down? Where do we get involved? So when I say we're the human factor, is everybody investigate what occurs in a cyber scenario. Nobody investigates what occurs after the cyber scenario with respect to how did it occur with respect to our people. Was it a specific person? Was it a click, an email compromise? We usually just try to remediate the issue at hand. So that's where we get involved with respect to the breach piece, and we'll go in and do interviews with the people and do some testing with respect to what is your sensitivity to this? How do you understand this? How does this occur? Is this type of the information? More importantly, if you as IT professionals identify specifics with respect to what occurred during the breach, is we're the human factor that can ultimately look at how do we access that information. So I need to turn this a little bit. So in my world, there's 3 types of compromise. And number 1 is those that, this is a little slow. There. Those that have been and know it. So we all know about that. We heard lots of information about breaches and how they occur. And then there's, as we heard about the fact that there's those that, I'll take that, thank you. Awesome. Those that don't know it. And finally, those that are clueless about it. And it's gonna happen either way. So with that is, how do we deal with that? And we've heard about the breach piece a lot today with how we report it. So we don't want to be these individuals that Saskatchewan Health gets breached and private records are exposed, but they claim they're not exposed. And so there's no evidence of any information finding its way out of our organization through this attack. Right off the hop, CEO, it's probably not the best response we want from an investigative point of view when we look after this, after the fact, is that no, there was no breach, right? Denial is not going to win you this battle when it comes to a breach. And then we take a step further and we look at eHealth says no personal medical information has been compromised, clinical services are not being disrupted. Again, not the case at all if you're familiar with this breach. So what ultimately happens is it affected millions of files. It was over 5 million pieces of files and data that they had that ultimately came down to 500 and some odd thousand files that were ultimately breached with this. So how does that affect things? Well, from an investigative point of view, when we're looking at that, there's the flaw. We need to investigate where that occurred. And with all due respect to everybody in the room, we hire IT professionals for IT. And if there's a breach that goes on, that's great. But IT professionals aren't investigators, and investigators aren't IT professionals. They're 2 very different things. So if you hire IT professionals to investigate an IT breach, and in particular if you're a large corporation and that's internal, there's a bit of a conflict of interest in there. When it comes down to the fact that IT professionals are investigating something that happened in their department, there's going to be a bit of a brotherhood when it comes to that. Or is it better off looked at from an external lens with external investigators that have no vested interest in the IT world but can look at it from the layman's term on how this occurred? And these guys aren't the only ones. LifeLab got hacked for 15 million files. Everybody's health information was compromised. Desjardins Insurance. We heard about insurance recently with Ridge Insurance. These are clients of ours. All the insurance companies is who I work for when it comes to this and all the investigations that we do for human intelligence. Desjardins is a client of mine that was affected by a breach that affected how we do business with them. So when we hear earlier about the insurance factor and how that pans in with respect to everybody's individual operation on a daily basis, we're the ones that have to jump through all that hoops, and I'm not an IT professional, so it's very difficult for us to navigate those pieces when we're a small company and I deal with humans. Obviously, there's a lot of them out there. I won't belabor. Government's getting hit, and that's the new vector when it comes to attacks, right? So both Saskatchewan and Nunavut are attacked with respect to this. And ultimately it comes down to that. The worst screen that we want to see, your ransomware, we don't want to access any of that. And how does that ultimately affect where things head? So from our perspective is there's common cyber threats. We've heard about them today. There's ransomware, obviously, phishing, data leakage, man-in-the-middle attacks, and insider threat. And these are all things that IT professionals can protect against. But can IT professionals protect against insider threat if you're not aware of where it comes from? And we heard a stat earlier was 93%. My stat that I looked up was 95%. All require a mistake or a misclick. So again, IT identifies it occurred, there's a breach, what occurred, but how did it occur and where did the information go after that and what's done with it? So IT weakness is not the same as risk management. IT and risk management are two separate things. So where we see the disconnect as investigators is you can have all the IT security protocol in place, but as me as the CEO, I'm responsible for that, that's great. But if the CEO doesn't like it because it slows things down too much or makes things more difficult, or I don't like to have to identify my multi-factor authentication when I do my banking, I'm the problem. And so IT doesn't necessarily identify those factors. That's the human element, the human investigation piece that needs to be, see where did the fail go down when it comes to the IT. So when we do an investigation, we think about the now, the what, the why, the how, all of those issues. And we look at it from the IT perspective. So what that looks at is now what? So we've had a breach and we go through that. Well, obviously, we've got to activate disaster recovery plans, great. And we feel kind of a little bit like this guy when we go down this process about, okay, we're about to set off the mousetrap and we've got all our protective equipment on. We heard about recovery systems, about, okay, what's your 0-day recovery point on the aspect of how that affects things and where's your data set. But if we're going to continue the same actions during this process, we're not going to be any further ahead. So we need to look at the emergency plan and how that affects things, identify the vulnerabilities and plug the breach, obviously. And that's all for your IT professionals, the coaches, the mitigation people, and conduct a post-investigation investigation. That's where we come in, not for the recovery plan, but to assist on, okay, this happened, how does it prevent from happening again? Interview the people, find out where the protocol are missing, and how do we implement that piece from an investigation point of view. And then implement those policies that follow that. So that's the now what from an IT perspective. Great. Now, how do we do it compared to the human factor? When we think of the human factor, it's those critical issues that as humans, we all make mistakes. We get rushed, we worry through things, we have some difficulty when it comes to how we implement our processes, our policies. We look at passwords, how does that affect things? We have shared, reused, weak, written down. So how often in your IT security audit do you address these issues and physically go into the CEO's office and saw in the commercial before that it's written up on the wall? Do we look under the keyboard and see that it's there? Do we look at those aspects? And those are your weaknesses. And that's where the investigative side, post-breach, can assist on that aspect. If we address different things with respect to phishing exploits and how those ultimately go through. Was it an email? Was it SMS? Was it smishing? Was it a business email compromise? So the business email compromise is great. We saw lots of examples with respect to that. But again, it's a cultural thing. So have you investigated the culture that created the breach in the first place? And how do you address those issues? Not from a physical hardware or software point of view. That's fine. There's lots of areas to protect on that. But from the human point of view, because that's where the errors occur. And the statistics say that. It's 93%, 95%, depending on what statistics you look at, on where those factors are. We look at the data leakage, what occurred with respect to that. Social media, was it? Man-in-the-middle attack, social engineering. I'm going to give you a scenario, and there's not too many people in this room. Show of hands quickly, who has children or grandchildren? Pretty much 95% of the room. So I'll give you a scenario on a social engineering attack and a social media attack on how we see it in the investigative world. So if you have a social media account out there and you have Facebook and you're logged in and you comment on your grandkid's graduation or your child's graduation, and we know they went to Newmarket High and that they're a specific class, graduating class, that's great. If I'm an up-to-do lawyer and my kids go to private school and that's out there in public information as well, because I have pictures of my kids in uniform, first day of school, and everything else. That's social engineering. That's where I take all that information from social media that we all freely put out there on LinkedIn profiles, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you name it, and we provide comments on that and we give some insight to these individuals. Now, I'm a public figure. You can Google me, you'll find my company, you'll find my email address. It's not rocket science. And if you look at a Facebook profile, you might be able to figure out where my kids are going to school. Think about this scenario where an email lands in your box with all these active shooters and police officers getting shot, and we're hearing about it on a daily basis right now. And you get an email from your school that says, it's from St. Andrews College in Aurora, where your kids go to private school. It says, "Dear Mr. Elliot, active shooter warning." We're all going to click on the email. And we click on the email that says, "Don't worry, Mr. Elliot, just to let you know there's an active shooter situation. The kids are in hold and secure. And we don't have to worry about their safety, situations being taken care of, but we have a change in plans on how you're going to pick your kids up from after school today. Click on the following link to figure out how to do it." That's what it's evolved to. That's what's occurred with respect to that piece. So when we look at it from an investigative point of view, it's not just the IT piece that we need to secure. It's not the passwords that we need to secure. It's the public profile of those C-suite individuals, those core individuals. It's the weakest chain in the link that it comes down to that is going to be exploited when that's the weakness that we're after. And so it's the cultural piece that also needs to be investigated on what's appropriate on posting. What do we want to look at from social media? How do we want to access this information? What messaging do we want to get out there with our people, and how do they interact? So those are considerations when we're thinking about breach and breach protocol and how to facilitate these particular items. Now, I don't think my clicker's working at all. I think someone's clicking for me. Is it? Are you clicking for me? Okay, so I'm just going to go like that, and you can click for me. So BYOD. So we think about this and BYOD and how it occurs, that how did this happen? So we went from, and this is an IT security nightmare. We went from nobody, oh, that's why, because I got gyms on PowerPoint. If I click on that one, oh, there we go, and now I have control. Hey, I was given the wrong clicker. Okay, so BYOD, bring your own device. We all have protocol in place. COVID happens. None of us were allowed to bring devices home. And if you did, you had to jump through all these hoops and everything else. Overnight, we made it acceptable to bring the iPad home, to bring the phone home, to connect to Wi-Fi that's never been tested, to connect to third-party servers, all of that. And there was comment about it about being the biggest breach issue down the road at the early onset by Jim. There was a debate over here with a gentleman thinks otherwise. I tend to agree on this side of the room that I think this is a massive landmine, and we're going to see a lot of repercussions with respect to that. So I question how we went from a need and a want to a mandatory scenario where we brought computers, networks, and everything else, and this is a massive issue. It's going to be a massive issue. So now we're post-COVID, and we have options to work from home or not work from home. Again, from an investigative point of view, have we looked at any of these protocols? Have we gone to employees' houses and tested their internet to see whether or not there's third-party applications operating in the backside of that? Probably not. That's a weakness, right? These are things that we took as verbatim and we're gonna accept them and going forward, but the reality of it is they're not going to work in that capacity. So we think of the human factors and how do those ultimately get in there? So we've had a breach. How do we deal with that? Well, pretty straightforward, right? Number one is reset all your passwords, set the minimum standards. Now, how do we remember those or whatever? As IT professionals, do you support the use of third-party software when it comes to password keepers and things? Yes, no, indifferent. We're not comfortable with that, right? So we have some issues with that. Some people are comfortable with it. Some people are not. I've heard mixed emotions. It's a salted hash. Don't have to worry about it. It's safe. It's secure. And it's still somebody there in somebody else's world, somebody else's thing. So when we talk about the keys of the kingdom or the secret sauce, how do we prevent that? A tip that I teach on with respect to this on the simplest level is I take the website that I'm visiting or the particular location that I'm at, if I'm doing my CIBC banking, and you can't figure it out, so good luck, but I have a core password. So it would be Keith Elliot loves to play hockey, and I acronize that. And I'll put my favorite hockey player there, Wayne Gretzky 99, and I put a star beside it. So that's my Keith Elliot loves to play hockey, so KEL, the number 2, PH, 99 star. There's my core password. I use that for pretty much anything. Now take the front, the middle, or the end of the website you're visiting, first 3, 4 characters, and mix it in there somewhere. You'll never forget your password. If you use the same pattern, similar, it's 1 or 2 tries. If it's only single authentication issues, you don't have to worry about it. But when you look at it from that point of view, I now have a 12-character password. I've taken Sony, because I'm going to Sony, or CIBC, or RBC, or whatever my banking is. I use my root password accordingly and spread that out. It's going to be fairly hard to figure that out. And as long as you change your root password once in a while and those passwords, you can do it without using a password keeper. Because it gets a little complicated and you don't have to remember them. And we're all guilty of using multiple passwords. At least most of us are. So then we got to create policies with respect to awareness training and update our policies on emails, email warnings. What does that look like? BYOD guidelines, we talked about that briefly already. And what are the work from home rules? What are you allowed to connect to? What's acceptable? When do you turn your device off? When does it time out? These are all things that aren't being covered. What's the USB policy? You've all heard the story about whether or not we weaponize uranium and how that was stopped. Well, that's a salting campaign. And I guarantee if I take a USB stick somewhere in somebody's office and plant it, someone's going to pick it up and plug it in, especially if it says vacation photos or important. It's going to occur. Again, that's where the investigators come in. We hear about pen testing, and we have red team, and we have white team, and we have black, blue. I like to think of us as purple. Purple, and we've heard that term before, purple is the human factor. We address those issues. I promise you, my investigators could walk into 80% of the organizations out there with a suit and a briefcase and walk out with a laptop, or walk in with a USB key and plug it in. My people, my investigators, are skilled surveillance individuals. They sit in cars all day long. They follow people in grocery stores. They look at what credit cards are being utilized. We're the private sector police when it comes down to that scenario. So my individuals are highly skilled at this, and we do work in conjunction with IT professionals on the physical penetration testing on how that gets in. They're very crafty at pretext and convincing individuals on how to access information. So what does that look like? How do you access that? Obviously, we want to silo information when it comes to intellectual property or copyrighted sensitive and Wi-Fi use, right? Like, we're all guilty of connecting to Wi-Fi, like tether off the phone, pay your employees to have an unlimited plan. It's not rocket science, right? Like, it's pretty simple this day and age. If you want to set them up and make them secure, have those policies in place, you need to tether off the device. It's secure, it's encrypted, or at least it should be. And how does that access different things? So a story for you with respect to this, and I've got about 6 minutes left. So this is an individual we were investigating, and your IT professionals, clarify this for me. Anybody been hired under an alias? I don't need to know what it is, but has anybody been hired under an alias in Canada at all? One. Okay, so this individual works for an IT company, was hired out of the United States, works in Canada under an alias. Canadian law kind of prevents that, but somehow this occurred. So they let that happen, and then he had limited information about him. They met via Zoom. He kind of looked like the photo there, dark hood up there, and we'll get to that in a sec. And he was given remote access. So it's a US-based company working here in Canada. And then with that, he's providing IT and tech support, and he's also allowed to sub-host services. So he's allowed to use server space from them and create his own thing and do whatever he wants, whether it's storage, VPNs, that type of thing. So this goes on for a while, and this young gentleman is not working. He's not logging in. There's no data logs with respect to that, and he's working at night. So they challenge him on it. They're like, hey, what's going on here, right? And he gets uppity, and he doesn't like the fact that they challenge him on the fact that he's not working and taking a paycheck. So they ultimately fire him, and his services are suspended. Well, he takes exception to that because he was hosting this and making money on the back door over that. So ultimately, they want him to, and I've lost my clicker. Can we click? Yeah. They want to give him access because there's still a down server. So he takes their server down instantly. And so our client says, the batteries are dead on this. Can you click? We get this. You can populate the screen for me. That's good. So we get this image, and the client says, find them. Because all they gave us was that image, his Instagram account that it was posted from, because one of his coworkers had messaged with them. We get a phone number, we get some banking info, and we get an old address. And we have to find him, because he's right now put a pretty much end of days attack on their system and shut it down, and they need to recover. And also, he starts a smear campaign, and he starts doxing the CEO with respect to this. So how do I do that? And this is where we come in from the human factor. You've had a breach or compromise. This is an employee that compromised this. And because he was hired on an alias, we don't even know what his real name is. I have a bank account number. Legally, I can't access that in Canada. That is not public information. So that's no good. I have an Instagram profile. Well, that's a big alias. Great. I have a phone. Okay, I got one good thing. But the phone is a spoofed number. So it's a fake number routed through a different server. And the old address, I can get some intel on that. I go back, I find out who used to live there. It's possibly a similar origin and name, so great, we go after that. It came down to the phone. My investigators called him up and said, hey, you called me, and we did the blind line type thing. And said, you called me? He says, no, I didn't. He says, you called me. And says, well, who is this? And I don't know, who's this? And little back and forth. And I got a female investigator to call this young gentleman. And because we know from an Instagram profile that he's fairly flirtatious. He's talking about his birthday and trying to get lucky and a few other things that he's looking there. So we'll play on that. So my female investigator performs what we call a honey trap. And the honey trap ultimately sits out the fact that she baits the hook and flirts with him a little bit and says, okay, sorry, wrong number, we'll talk to you later, leaves it alone. Lets it sit for a little bit. Then we get a snowstorm and she messages blindly. She's like, hey, I'm bored. What are you doing? Oh, who is this? Whatever. They go back and forth. He convinces her. She convinces him to give him his real phone number. Okay, now we got a good starting point. And then we start to chat a little more. And ultimately it gets down to the point where we're talking about the different things. And he says, oh, I had some Uber Eats. So as investigators, we have resources and sources. We're trying to solve the problem for a client. So we happen to have somebody that has access to Uber Eats information. And so we look at the phone number and cross-reference it. And lo and behold, we get a possible address. But now I have to send a team out. And the team sits out there for 24 hours. And this guy is the proverbial in the basement hacker, right? He's got the hood on, he's got the wine, he's got everything else. And we got to prove that he's there. Well, he's living in Airbnbs and he's bouncing around from location to location to location. So we have to further the honeypot wherein we say to him, hey, I'm kind of bored, I'm in town, I wouldn't mind meeting you. Are you interested? And we have it set up because we've got the house figured out. We saw him come out. He took an Uber Eats delivery. We've got a good visual of him. We're fairly certain it's him. And we rang the phone while he was getting the Uber Eats delivery. So we saw him try to pick up. So we know it's him. So we're like, okay, we got the guy. So lo and behold, fast forward, as we're almost out of time, is the day comes. Well, guess what day we planned the takedown on? Valentine's Day. Because he's romantic at heart. And so we go and do the takedown on that. Now in private sector, and this is where we come in as well, we work with the lawyers and the legal teams or whatever. We don't need a search warrant like in police sector. We don't need to break down doors, kick in things, and do everything else. We utilize tools known as Morava injunctions, Norwich orders, and Anton Pillar orders. And so Morava injunction is the ability to seize bank accounts because a fraud's occurred. A Norwich order is the ability to trace information that you believe a fraud has occurred. So in this particular case, we utilized a Norwich order to get some information about where the transfers were going because he had committed a crime of denying service to this computer. On the day of, we swear to an Anton Pillar order, which allows us to knock on the door with the police in tow and the lawyer in tow, where we simply read them the order, we're coming in, we're doing a search warrant, and we're seizing all of these items, and the police verify that this is legit and leave if he agrees to keep the peace. If he doesn't want to keep the peace, he'll end up in handcuffs and he'll go in the back of a cruiser. But if they agree to keep the peace and cooperate, we move on with them. And from there, we go in and do the search. So if I can get the click on the next slide, that's our search in his basement. And there's the bottle of wine that's the ultimate linchpin that he's posting in the Instagram photo with. So we're in the basement apartment. We bring in IT professionals. We search every crevice. And you find things you don't want to find. He's the lone bachelor in his house, and there was a few things on the floor I'd rather not talk about. And yeah, pretty icky, and you can see the bed's a mess and all the rest of it. But this is our team. I have an investigator that is videotaping the entire interaction. There's 2 lawyers, one appointed by the courts, one appointed by the plaintiff, in our particular, our client. And then we've got an IT professional that's logging every single device, and we're looking at all the metadata as well as the RAM being accessed on PlayStations and everything else so we don't lose it all, and we seize it all. And we seize it from the point of view that we then go before a court publicly to convince why we need it. We're trying to eliminate the disposal of evidence in this particular case. He cooperated, he pled guilty, he turned it all over, problem, and now it's the remediation. But they wanted to stop the bleeding because he continued to attack them and continued the smear campaign. So that's where we come in as private sector investigators. And that's kind of my story for you with respect to that. If we can just kind of click, I'll pop up my contact information. We're kind of out of date. We're looking for change, and so we want to follow up on that external issue, right? It's not chance that this occurred. We need to influence the change that occurs with respect to that and interview the employees, find out where the breach is. We can help in that regard as investigators, and there's lots of people that do what I do, but there you go. And that's where we're at because we're out of time.